We are now starting the third unit or the third portion of our course. It will cover the nervous system. It will be chapters 12, 13, 14 for test number 3, and then separately chapter 16 on the eye and the ear for the department exam. Now when it comes to chapters 12, 13, 14, we're going to do it in the following order. We're going to do chapter 12, which will be broken down into part 1 and part 2. Chapter 12, part 1 will start on page 437 up to page 452. So we're going to do chapter 12, part 1, then we'll do chapter 13 on the brain, chapter 14 on the spinal cord, and then we're going to return to chapter 12 for the second half starting on page 453. Doing it in this order will ensure that we are efficient with our time and we avoid repeating ourselves as the book does time to time. So we're going to start with chapter 12. Now the video sessions will be in this order. The first one will be titled Chapter 12 and Beyond. That's the first video for the nervous system. The second video will be titled Chapter 13 on Brain. The next video will be titled Chapter 14 on the spinal cord, and then we'll return to Chapter 12, Part 2 for the nervous system. Starting with Chapter 12, we start with this slide. I don't care for the first one, but I do care for this slide. Now this slide starts with a concept that I'm going to use for an analogy. The analogy being the SIM card. The SIM card S, and then the SIM cards I, and then the SIM cards M. The S stands for sensory or input. So our nervous system is very much like our cell phone's SIM card. The S stands for sensory, which is input. The I will stand for integration, which is processing. Now the I, or integration or processing, will be done by the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and spinal cord will do the integration, the processing. Then we have the letter M for motor. Now M is motor output. Now when it comes to chapter 12, they call motor output an effector. And on the slide, the very last line says that motor output effectors are muscles or glands. That's very, very important to realize that the output, which is a motor, will be an effector, which is a muscle or a gland. Okay, so we have S, we have I, and we have M. Next slide. Next slide is page 438. And on page 438, we see the picture that says central nervous system. The central nervous system are only two things, the brain and the spinal cord. So as you can see, if we take the last slide and this slide, we now know that the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, will deal with integration, processing. We also see that anything that comes off the brain will belong to the peripheral nervous system. Anything that comes off the spinal cord will also be peripheral nervous system. So anything off the brain, off the spinal cord will belong to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, next slide. Now this slide mentions something at the very top. So this slide number 5 for us, it says sensory nervous system, and then it says afferent. Now earlier I told you that sensory is input. Well, that input is considered afferent. And that spelling is important. Afferent. That means it's going to the brain or to the spinal cord. So afferent is either going to the brain or to the spinal cord. That's afferent for sensory. Then at the bottom of the page, we have motor. And notice motor goes with efferent. And that's an E, efferent. Now, efferent is coming from the brain from the spinal cord. Okay? So motor is coming from the brain, from the spinal cord. Now in this case here we see other words at the bottom. Somatic. Somatic refers to voluntary movement, such as skeletal muscles. So somatic is going to be voluntary, skeletal muscles. Then at the very bottom of this slide, we have autonomic nervous system, and that's with the autonomic. Now, for Nemish, the word autonomic means automatic. It's involuntary. So autonomic, automatic, involuntary. Now, the autonomic nervous system has two divisions mentioned at the very bottom of the slide: sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, a little tidbit about both of those. The sympathetic deals with fight or flight, basically your emergency situation. It gets you all revved up to deal with emergencies. So that's sympathetic, fight or flight. Then we have parasympathetic. Now, parasympathetic is really supposed to be back to homeostasis, back to rest. Now, a lot of instructors will mention parasympathetic as rest and digest. And in A&P 2, you'll understand why they say that. But for us, keep in mind, parasympathetic is back to homeostasis. Okay, next slide. Here's a picture version, same page, page 438. And the picture version shows you the same thing. We have the somatic, we have the somatic sensory side, we have the somatic motor side, and then in the very last one we have the autonomic. Again, on the top of the slide, you clearly see it says sensory as input and motor as output. So sensory is going to the brain, to the spinal cord, and motor is from the brain, from the spinal cord. Next slide. Okay, now we go to this slide. Now, before we even start on this slide, you're going to notice some similarity mentioned with the muscle chapter. Muscles and nerves are excitable electrically and chemically. That was a mantra we had before. That same mantra continues again. Also, you see on this slide excitability, and the second one being conductivity. Notice they are the same two you had for muscles earlier for the skeletal muscle. So excitable and conductive. Neurons, just like muscles, are excitable and they are conductive. And they're excitable how? Electrically and chemically. Now, right about here, we need to mention something of the past. There were 3 laws I gave you in the muscle chapter which now apply here as well. And you'll see that in both the part 1 of chapter 12 and also returning on the second part of chapter 12 as well. The 3 laws were the law of refractory period, the law of threshold, and the law, what's the other one? All or none. So all or none, threshold, and refractory period. The same 3 laws apply to neurons as well. Okay, the third dash on this slide here is something we've already seen, where it says release of neurotransmitter. If you recall, we actually had ACH as a neurotransmitter coming out of the motor neuron at the synaptic end bulb. That's the same comment here as well. So yes, we do have neurotransmitters released from the synaptic end bulb at the end of the motor neuron. Okay, next slide. Don't care, don't care, don't care. Okay, this picture I do care. This picture is important. It is located on page 441. So page 441. Now on this page, at the very, very top, we have our typical neuron. So our typical neuron at the top. You'll see here we have little antlers at the top. Those antlers are really just dendrites. So those antlers at the very top are nothing more than dendrites. Now, what do you think we have on these dendrites? And we have to have one information passed on from one neuron to another to another neuron. What do we have there? We have receptors. So just like we had receptors on the motor end plate for a muscle, we have receptors here too. So the dendrites will contain receptors. Then the next big area we have there is the cell body. The cell body. Okay. Now the cell body contains pretty much all the factories. It's got the nucleus, it's got mitochondria, all the stuff that typically a cell would have. Then we have this long stretch. That long stretch is the axon. Now just before we start the axon, there's a place that's labeled on that picture there called axon hillock. It's at the very, very top, axon hillock. Make sure you look at it on page 441. Now that axon hillock is where a true action potential starts. So a true action potential starts at the axon hillock. Before that, it is not an action potential. It only becomes an action potential at the axon hillock. As you can see, that is also the starting point of a true neuron's axon. So that long piece is the axon. Also notice these axons have little pillows attached to them. Those blue pillows are actually a covering, a coating, and that's called a myelin sheath. That's also labeled for you in the picture, a myelin sheath. Now that myelin sheath serves two purposes. Now the idea of having myelin is called myelination. So the fact that that neuron in our picture on page 441 has this little pillow, that myelin sheath is called myelination. And myelination has two purposes. One, it protects the neuron. So that's the first function of myelination, protecting the neuron. Second function for myelination is to increase the speed of conduction. So if you have a neuron with a myelination like you see here, it's going to be much faster. So myelination increases the speed of conduction. If we have a neuron that's not myelinated, so there are neurons that are not myelinated, then they're going to be much slower. Now, this myelination that we're speaking of also adds color to it. So the rule of thumb is this: myelination makes it white. So myelin, being a protein, is a white colored material. So neurons that are myelinated are going to be white. Now what about the neurons that are not myelinated? Neurons that are not myelinated are going to be gray. So neurons that are not myelinated. Now we call those unmyelinated neurons, and they tend to be gray. So that's what we have so far. Then a little bit further down, we see a little extension here. Now if you look in the little inset box on page 441, does that look very much like our neuromuscular junction that we had in the muscle chapter? It does. Because remember, muscles and nerves operate pretty much the same way. So that little inset picture we see on page 441 looks very much like our neuromuscular junction. It's got the same little synaptic vesicles with neurotransmitters. It's got receptors on the other end. It's got ACH or some kind of neurotransmitter in there. Very similar. Now this time around, it's not called a neuromuscular junction. It's called a neuro-neuro junction. So page 441, that connection between one neuron and that of another neuron is a neuro-neuro junction. Operates the same as a neuromuscular junction. Okay, next, this myelination we spoke of, there are two possible types of cells depending on the book. Your textbook here labels it as neurolemocyte, and you can see it in the picture, neurolemocyte. Some books call it Schwann cell. This book will also call it a Schwann cell, but just a little bit further down the line in the chapter. So Schwann cell or neurolemocyte, same thing. All right, next slide. Okay, now this title here is important after you draw a line. Our next topic is called neuron transport. Do not copy this slide. Here's what we're going to get at. So our title is going to be neuron transport, but I'm going back. Okay. All right, bear with me for a second. Here we go. We're back. Now on this slide, we see that little myelination I mentioned. Well, that myelination, as I said, makes it go faster. But on the surface of the neuron, we're going to have the electrical signal. Just like we did for the muscle. If you recall, on the muscle, we had a muscle action potential on the sarcolemma, which was the covering of it. The same way here, that's where the nerve action potential will be. It'll be on the covering. Now the slide that I was on a moment ago called neuron transport, that slide says that how do I move materials? Not the action potential, but the materials. The materials will move within the center of the axon. Now, instead of writing all of this, understand that it's called neural transport and materials move bidirectional. So the materials will move bidirectional within, inside of the axon. Okay, so materials will move bidirectional inside of it. The action potential will move on the surface, and the action potential always moves in one direction. It always goes from the dendrite all the way to the other end, which was the synaptic end bulb. So action potentials only go in one direction. Okay, moving on. Don't care. Don't care. Now this picture I do care. This picture is on page 443. Now for a test purpose, what they ask you about this page is simply knowing the three types you see there. The first three types, multipolar, bipolar, and unipolar. You should know for the test, what it looks like. So multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. The page number is page 443. Now again, regardless of what it looks like, the action potential always goes from dendrite to the synaptic end bulb. So action potentials are always unidirectional. Next slide. Okay, now this slide is a repeat. So you really do need to incorporate it into something I already said at the start of chapter 12. We already said that sensory is input. So sensory is input. We also use the term afferent earlier. And we now know that afferent is to the brain, to the spinal cord. That's what they're trying to mention again. Then in the middle we see motor. Motor was an output, and we use terms like efferent. And the efferent was from the brain, from the spinal cord, and there we use words like effectors, which are muscles and glands. Then at the bottom, we have interneuron. Now, interneurons are also called association neurons. That is important to write down. Now, where do you think you should write interneuron and association neuron already in your notes? It should be put under I for integration. And remember, we said that I, integration, processing is interneuron, it's association neuron. And what things actually do the interneuron, the processing, the integration? It's going to be the brain and spinal cord. So this is a repeat in essence. Next slide. Okay, here's a picture. This picture is worthwhile keeping in mind. The page number for this picture is page 444. And on page 444, you see something interesting. It's a picture rendition of what we've learned so far. Here we have our receptors of our skin. We have a sensory input in blue, a sensory input. It goes into the spinal cord. Then something happens in the spinal cord in purple as part of the interneuron, the association neuron, the integration, the processing. And then we have a motor neuron that leads as a motor output to a muscle or a gland. Remember, muscles or glands are effectors for motor output. Now in this picture, you see the S, the I, and the M. And again, where's the processing occurring? It's occurring in the interneuron, the association neuron area. So the brain and the spinal cord will do the processing. Okay, now while we have this picture, I want to highlight something called posterior root ganglion. Now, if you recall from your terminology, another way of saying posterior is dorsal. So posterior or dorsal root ganglion. Notice it is not in the spinal cord. If it's not in the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system, then where is this dorsal or posterior root ganglion? Remember earlier I mentioned that if it's not on the brain, so it's coming off the brain, it's peripheral nervous system. If it's coming off the spinal cord, it's again peripheral nervous system. So the dorsal root ganglion or the posterior root ganglion that you see in the picture, that's part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, what does the dorsal root ganglion contain? It contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. So the dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. So all the cell bodies of sensory neurons are congregated there. And yes, it's part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, next slide. I really don't care. Now, this picture, I briefly care, but I don't want you to worry too much about this one. This is page 445. If you look at the picture, you notice that's a tube within a tube within a tube. Very similar to our muscle. So for my test, and for the department exam for that matter, be aware that it's very similar to the organization of a skeletal muscle. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a repeat as before, so I don't care. Okay, now this slide I do care for. Now on this slide, it's really a rehash of what we've already learned as well. Remember I said muscles and nerves can be electrically and chemically stimulated. So electrically and chemically excitable. That's what this slide is actually getting at. Next slide. Don't care. Don't care. Don't care. Okay, this slide I do care, but not this way. Actually, let's go back for a second. Do you recall, even though we've never seen this slide before, do you recall something in the parentheses there? We learned that for the nervous system, we only have two kinds of cells. We're either speaking of a neuron, which is what we saw a moment ago. So we're either talking about a neuron, or what was the other type of cell we have in the nervous system? Neuroglia. And what did neuroglias do from the previous knowledge? Neuroglias support the neurons. And that's exactly what we're going to see here as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, now this is the first type of neuroglia. Now this one is important, and I will highlight this slide. The first type of neuroglia that we're going to look at is astrocytes. Now astrocytes, by its root there, astro, is star-shaped. Now the main purpose of astrocytes is to act as part of a blood vessel in the brain. So it acts as part of the blood vessels of the brain. And what they do is they actually act in a concept called the BBB, and that stands for blood-brain barrier. So these astrocytes actually act like little filters, and we'll see that in a moment. They actually act as a filter. So whatever blood vessels you have in your brain are actually going to be filtering the blood and letting certain things into the brain. So from your blood to your brain. And there's actually certain things that are being filtered. So the blood-brain barrier is very important in filtering the liquid of your brain and allowing only certain things to enter your brain space. Now, what kinds of things do go into the brain space? Glucose is number one. Glucose enters the brain. Okay, so that's number one. The second thing that enters the brain is alcohol. So alcohol does leave the brain and enters into the brain space. So from the blood to the brain. So we have glucose and we have alcohol. We also have nutrients. So some nutrients cross. We have ions like sodium, potassium. These kinds of ions also cross the BBB. Now, what should not cross the BBB? Germs. So typically, bacteria and germs do not cross the BBB. Now, HIV, for example, does. So there are certain germs that will cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so the blood-brain barrier acts as a filter which allows certain things to go through, like glucose, like alcohol, like ions, like fluids, like water, for example. So water does cross. And what doesn't, typically germs do not cross the BBB, the exception being HIV. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next type we're going to look at is epidermal cells. Now, the epidermal cells have within them something called a choroid plexus. So I would look at it this way. A choroid plexus is a blob of blood vessels. And that's a word you want to be aware of. So when someone says choroid, and you'll see a lot of that in A&P1 and A&P2, choroid is a blob of blood vessels. And a choroid plexus has within it epidermal cells. Let me say that one more time. So the choroid plexus has within it epidermal cells. And these cells, called epidermal cells, produce cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? So we'll see a little bit later that we have a choroid plexus. Within it is epidermal cells, and these epidermal cells produce cerebrospinal fluid. We make and circulate, so make and circulate about 500 mils of cerebrospinal fluid. So about 500 mils of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Okay, the one I care for next is oligodendrocytes at the bottom of the slide. Now, oligodendrocytes, notice the title. We're dealing with central nervous system. Oligodendrocytes also have myelination, but they're part of the central nervous system. So oligodendrocytes have myelinated neurons, but they're part of the central nervous system. Okay, so oligodendrocytes, part of central nervous system, but they do produce the myelin neurons. Okay, next slide. All right, so that was a picture form now on page 446. So this is the picture version of what we've gone through. So we mentioned astrocytes, we mentioned epidermal cells, and then I skipped over and mentioned the oligodendrocytes. These are all neuroglias of the central nervous system. Okay, next slide. Okay, now I'm changing gears again. And now we're going to look at the neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system. That's what PNS is, peripheral nervous system. Now, if you look at the second bullet that I care for, it says neurolemocytes, something I mentioned earlier. And I told you that neuroleukocytes are also called Schwann cells. And these are the ones that make myelination. So they do the myelinated neurons, but for where though? For the peripheral nervous system. So neuroleukocytes, Schwann cells, peripheral nervous system. Oligodendrocytes will be for the central nervous system. Very, very important distinction. Okay, next slide. Here's a picture version of the same thing. This one is now found on page 448. So this is page 448. Okay, draw a line. We're now on page 449. Now before we get there, we need to look at this slide. Tumors. When someone has a brain cancer, which is going to grow like wildfire, one of our former senators, Ted Kennedy, actually died of brain cancer. Brain cancers grow like wildfire because those are the tumors that grow quickly. So on page 449 or 448, they talk about glial cells or gliomas. They grow like wildfire and they're very, very bad. So cause of death from a glioma is very quick. Next slide. Okay, don't care. Don't care. This is something we've already seen. So this is another picture showing you the same thing. Next slide. Don't care. Don't care. Okay, this disease is on page 449. I do care. On this one, I want you to read the clinical box on page 449. Both diseases are important, and you want to read the clinical box on page 449. Next slide. Okay, the last topic, again on page 449. Actually, it's now on page 451, excuse me, page 451. And on page 451, it talks about axon regeneration. Now, there are some sort of controversy about this. They say that the central nervous system can regenerate just like the peripheral nervous system, but the truth is not really. So the textbook agrees with the common notion that the central nervous system really does not regenerate. So the central nervous system does not regenerate. It's only the peripheral nervous system that has the ability to regenerate. So be aware of that. That's all I care for on page 451. You are going to see a picture and information. I'm going to skip all of that. All I want you to know for test purposes, peripheral nervous system has the ability to regenerate. Central nervous system typically does not. Okay. All right. Now, that has caused me to get to page 452. And if you recall, up to page 452 is part 1 of chapter 12. So we're going to stop here for part 1 of chapter 12. The title of the video will be Chapter 12 and Beyond.